Good afternoon. My name is Roger Hitchcock. Welcome to this Boardroom Fundamentals webinar presented by Sadar. I'm a senior partner with Sadar. You'll get to know me a little bit during our time together. So looking forward to spending the next 45 minutes or hour together. Ethics, foundations, or minefield, or both. So I'll give you some ideas on why I chose that as a topic. And while we're doing that, and while I'm giving a bit of an introduction, where are you logging on from? If you wouldn't mind in the chat box, and just select everyone so that we can all see where you are logging on from. But also, if you could, just what is your biggest ethics question, the biggest ethics question in your mind right now? Because as I'm going through the webinar, I'd love to link it into some of the thoughts, some of the perspectives that are in the group. And good to see some familiar names, good to see some names that are new as well. Where are you logging on from, and what is your big ethics question? Why foundations or minefield? In thinking about ethics, one of the challenges with ethics and what we want to explore during the course of our time together is that both minefields and foundations ultimately lie beneath the surface. They lie under the ground. They are invisible often. And that's often the challenge with this thing we call ethics. It's the challenge with this thing we call values and beliefs. And so what I want to do is spend a bit of time just unpacking some of the concepts around ethics, in a sense, not aiming to answer all the questions, but maybe raise critical conversations that we need to be having in our boardrooms. Because one of the big challenges in today's world is that if we don't talk about these things in the boardroom, they get glossed over. And I think that's one of the challenges that we want to address. And so what I want to do is provide you with some handles on how to have these conversations about things that lie beneath the surface. And they either are things that enable us to grow and enable us to develop, or they're things that can take us out. And that's why I chose these two metaphors of foundations or a minefield. Part of also what I want to cover today is, in essence, what today as well is a taster, an introduction to a program we call the Applied Directorship Program. The Applied Directorship Program is an 11-month program aimed at providing a working knowledge around a number of key areas in the governance space. It's based on our methodology, we call the Sadar Governance Compass, which essentially, if I had to put it in a nutshell, is what are the key themes that we as directors in the boardroom need to keep our heads around, get our heads around, converse around, talk around as we are playing this role of directing, and hence the picture of pointing in a direction, because that, in a sense, is the simplest thing that directors need to be doing, which means we need to know where we're going. We need to know what our destination is. We need to know what lies ahead of us and what are we pursuing. But as we embark on the journey of directing, and as our businesses embark on the journey of pursuing strategic objectives and goals and intentions and purpose, undergirding that is this concept of values and beliefs. And we touch on that during the Applied Directorship Program in the module called Organizational Culture. And so what I want to do is just pull out a few of the key concepts, expand it on some of them, develop some of them. Be great to get your comments and questions as we go. And good to see some of the names. Good to see you, Frank. Masvita, good to see you from Joburg. Look at Steinhoff, Marcus Jooster. We all know that that's current in the news flow in South Africa. For those of you out of South Africa, if you haven't heard of the name Marcus Jooster and Steinhoff, then Google it, because it's a fascinating unfolding story. The latest there is that the South African Reserve Bank and the tax authorities have literally closed him down in terms of his assets. There is progress 5 or 6 years later. Ashraf, in a corrupt South Africa, are companies actually interested in good governance? What a big question. And I know that this is one of the challenges. When I put a slide like this up, I always think, well, wow, what are we going to touch on? I think this is a challenge in our boardrooms. It's also a challenge of who do we get into our boardrooms? And so I'll touch on that as well, as how do we align what we say and what we do with an ethical foundation, and what we say and what we do with an outcome that could be seen as this thing called good governance? Is there a demand for good governance in South Africa and in Africa as a whole? Big question. We'll touch on that. So as we go through this afternoon, please keep dropping your questions, comments into either the chat box or the Q&A box. And the reason I'm turning my head every now and again is because that's where it is on a second screen in front of me. So if we look at some of the key concepts and some of the key metaphors undergirding this concept, that in a sense, ethics starts beneath the surface. It starts underground. And I will use a couple of other metaphors because I think there's a couple of metaphors that are even more powerful than foundations and Minefield, but they illustrate that this thing is invisible. And a couple of words I want to throw up that I want to unpack is, if we think of our foundations or our roots, those are the things we grow from. And I'll use this concept of roots quite a lot this afternoon. Foundations/roots. Ultimately, the roots of our business, the foundations of what we are trying to achieve, our purpose, in a sense, determines the roots, R-O-U-T-E-S, that we are able to pursue. And so we'll link what is unseen to what is seen, because obviously what's visible are the paths, the things we do, the actions, the roots, R-O-U-T-E-S, that grow from the roots, R-O-O-T-S. And we'll try to link those together because the one is invisible, the other is very much visible. Another set of words that are really important in this governance space, but also in this organizational culture space, in this values space, are beliefs and behaviors. And again, one of the challenges that we come across when we're thinking about organizational culture and values is it's not just what we see on the outside, the behaviors, but it's what's linked deeper, the beliefs, the values. Your question, is there a demand? I would argue, Ashraf, maybe another way to change that question, is there a belief in good governance in South Africa and in Africa? And I would argue around the world, there have been so many cases, and we'll touch on them as they spring to mind, but there seemed to be this continual flow of news flows around companies where we see their behaviors, we see what they do, we see the paths they choose to take, and we are forced to question what lies below that, what lies deeper than that. What is that an expression of in terms of what do they believe? What do they believe to be valuable? What are the foundations? What are the roots they are growing on? And if nothing else, this is a valuable set of conversations to have in your boardroom, because as we are exploring the concept of organizational purpose, organizational values, organizational culture, it's really important that these conversations start in the boardroom, because that's where they essentially flow from. One of the challenges around organizational culture is this link between the visible and the invisible. And a survey done a couple of years ago sums it up, because that survey was launched with this header: most directors are culture clueless. And what I like about it is it identifies some of the key elements of organizational culture that I want to touch on: the visible and the invisible, the surface or above the surface and below the surface. Only 50% of directors say they understand the collective behaviors, norms, and values at the front lines of the organization. And those are important. Those are really, really important words that we need to manage, and we need to keep in mind. These things like collective. So what is the group seen as? Because as a group of people pursuing a purpose, fulfilling objectives and intentions, there is a group of behaviors, norms, and values that are reflected not necessarily behind the scenes in the boardroom, but at the front of our businesses, where, as we say in South Africa, the techie hits the tar, or the tire hits the road. The real part of our business. And you'll see how the word ethics is an important one to think about, because that's the link between what is visible and what is invisible. Here are the questions that were asked in the survey, or two of the questions. How has the board considered how well aligned its corporate culture is with the purpose and strategy of the business? And Frank, exactly, that's the quote I often quote when I talk to this, is that famous quote by Peter Drucker, one of the fathers of management and thinking around how do we run businesses. Culture eats strategy for breakfast, which means what he's not saying is we don't need a strategy. What he is saying is that often the one overrides the other. And in his view, and I think in what we've seen around the world, is that the idea of companies with a strong strategy but no view on culture and purpose and values can often achieve great things at the expense of a whole lot of other things. The Enrons, the Boeings, the VWs, more recently the Steinhoffs. And so there needs to be this alignment between purpose, values, organizational culture, what we want to be known as, and the strategy of the business, because actually they work together. Metaphor I often use is they're like two railway lines on a railway track. You need both of them for a train to move forward, but one of them is laid first. And I would argue that we need to be thinking about purpose and values first before we simply jump to strategy. And that also reflects some of the thinking in some of the latest corporate governance input and recommendations are housed in a document called ISO 37000. Another set of great conversations to have around your boardroom table. And it starts at the center, at its core, is an understanding around purpose. And I would argue that's purpose and values in terms of what we are trying to stand for and achieve, and not just our strategy. Our strategy, as you can see, flows from that, as does our model of value generation, flows from the core purpose of the business. And that's why it's really important to think about alignment. Good question, good conversation to have in your boardrooms. And as I said, today is more about saying what conversations you need to have, because that raises the main issues. If we think about this, the set of words, how confident are you? Second question here, that the culture desired by the board and that which actually exists at all levels of the business are one and the same. The reality is, if we think about a board and a company, the organogram of the company, there's often a stated intent from the, call it the top down or from the back office forward. But the reality is, our businesses are experienced from the bottom up. They're experienced from the front end of the business. Our front end people are actually the carriers of the culture into the outside world, because it's the behaviors at the front that reflect what we actually truly believe as a business. Thanks again, Ashraf. I think one of the key things is whistleblower. So what are some of the structures and systems we have to think about internally in our businesses, but also in a nation as a whole or an environment as a whole that will support good ethics, good culture? And those are some of the things I want to start touching on, because at the end of the day, the systems and structures that we use to govern policies, procedures, processes, they serve a purpose to ensure that our companies perform, but also they serve a purpose to ensure that our performance is aligned with our purpose. And really important to think about that as we ask ourselves the question, how do we actually lead in our businesses? How do we as a board lead the businesses we are governing, and also engage with the operations of the business appropriately? And I believe that there is emerging what I like to call a new logic of leadership. Leadership in the past has been twofold. Firstly, it's been very person-centric, which means it's been run, or we view leadership as an individual who is a strong leader as an individual. The second thing is we often judge leadership by outcomes more than we judge it by means or ways to get there. And I think the current environment we are in, given the high transparency environment of online world, but also how we are measured and what we need to give an account for in our businesses, is changing. And so those two aspects of leadership are also challenging this deepening of thinking around why leaders lead. Two things. Firstly, around the boardroom table, it's not an individual leading a company. It's a team of people leading a company. And that's massive, because when an individual leads, it is their individual, their singular, in a sense, set of values and beliefs that often dominate. And the danger of that is a dominant personality can lead a company down a path that is very dangerous at the end of the day. And that's possibly where, Ashraf, your comment about whistleblowers has been so difficult in a leadership model that emphasizes the individual, because then it becomes a threat to the individual instead of a team of people asking, what do we need to be? How do we need to engage so that we can provide leadership as a team for a business? The second key thing is that if we simply think of leadership or the success of leadership based on outcomes, we are opening ourselves up as a society, in a sense, to ethics or bad values or bad beliefs. And I'm putting that bad quite broadly, overriding. In other words, if all we are judged on is what we achieve at the end, then how we get there could be incredibly damaging. And unfortunately, our systems, the system of the way the world works, the way economies work, has often been driven by that. And so I talk about this new logic of leadership, that leaders need to be thinking about where are they leading from? And instead of it being objectives and what we achieve, it has to start with what I like to call the heart, the head, and the hands. The reality is directors' duties are summed up in 3 words. It's a fiduciary relationship or a fiduciary duty, but a couple of the words are quite strongly ethically or values-based. The 3 words are care, skill, and diligence. And I would argue that care is an ethical word. It's a value-laden word, because we have to ask about who do we need to care for? The relationship, the fiduciary relationship, it's a legal relationship, but it's an ethically laden relationship because it is a relationship of care towards the companies that we are fiduciaries of. And that's challenging because in the way that we act, in the way that we engage as a team of leaders, how do we keep that center? And that's what I mean by disciplines or habits or activities of the heart. Is how do we exercise care in a relationship to our companies? Head, skill and diligence. And again, do we have the competency around the boardroom table to address, to handle, to deal with the complexities we are going through at the moment? And if not, a responsible team of leaders don't fight for their own interests and their own position. What they do is they say this company is the thing we are legally obliged to act in the best interest of. And so they tweak the team, work with the team, make sure we mold the team to deliver the best interest of the company. And so that's what I mean by diligence. How do we think of the skill set? Sorry, the skill set, the competency of the board. So care, skill, and then diligence is, are we diligently doing the work of directors? One of the big challenges. And again, diligence is an ethically laden word because the opposite of diligence is negligence. And that's the primary fault that is found when directors are accused and taken to court. They are found to be negligent in their duties. And so I would argue that even the two of those words primarily are ethically laden words, and we need to be asking ourselves, how do we exercise that in the boardroom and from the boardroom? Because ultimately, the hands of the company are not necessarily the board's hands. They are delegating to management and operations, and they're holding accountable. They are overseeing those hands that are actually doing the work. And the critical part is, how do we make sure that the right norms, the right values, the right beliefs move from what I said earlier, the back office, the boardroom, to the front office where the business actually meets its stakeholders, its customers, its suppliers, everybody on the ground. And what this means for us is that if we shift the metaphor from one of building, possibly, and warfare, foundations and minefields, which is often the way we think about business, and think of values and beliefs in a different context. The reason I've got an avenue of trees is because the word culture is linked more to the word cultivate than to any other word. And so as directors, we need to be discerning what is the difference between what we are cultivating and what we are constructing. So we work as governors with structures and systems and policies and processes and procedures. They can become we can become overwhelmed with that. Ultimately, those things exist only to ensure that the right thing is being cultivated. Think of when you're planting a garden, or those of you who planted trees. When you plant a tree, you dig a big hole wide for the roots of the tree to grow. You put some structures around it to ensure that the tree, while it is small, can grow healthily and is protected. Maybe even you put some mesh around it so that nothing knocks it over. you tie it to a stick. But as time goes on, so you change the things you construct, you change the support. You don't have to necessarily protect it in the same way. You treat it with different things as the tree grows and develops. And exactly the same with our companies. The structures and systems we put in place as governors must adapt over time as this entity called the company grows and develops. So the best metaphor for that, the cultivate and construct, is, or the best picture of that, is a vineyard. Because a vineyard, I know this isn't strictly a vineyard, but it illustrates the plant on a trellis. So you have the distinction between what is growing and what is structured. Because the things that are structured, the systems we put in place, should enable the right growth ultimately. You can't harvest the vineyard. You can't harvest many orchards unless there are structures in place to make it easy to do. And the trees are pruned appropriately. So the metaphor from agriculture, I believe, is a very powerful one to think about when we think about this concept of values and behaviors, what is above the surface and what is below the surface. And so I'll revisit this in terms when we end to say, well, what are some of the things we need to be thinking about in terms of alignment, cultivating and constructing? Because the danger is we get involved too much in the structures and systems of governance. We approve policies, or we think of structures or systems, or we think of accountability and oversight reporting. But we've got to ask the question, the deeper question, is that properly a reflection of what we are ultimately wanting to cultivate at the end of the day? I see that my camera has frozen. I'm not sure if am I still online. If someone could just drop into the chat box. I'm just not sure what's happened on my side, whether I'm still with you or not. Someone could just drop into the chat box whether you can still hear me. Good. Okay. Thank you. It seems like you can still hear me. My camera from my side seems to be frozen. Hopefully it will carry on. Let me just see if that's in the actual software. I'm quickly going to just reboot the software that I use and see if I can get back on track. But again, a good opportunity to reflect a little bit on what that means and whether there are any key questions that we have. I'm just sorry. Any questions or comments while I quickly just reboot or reboot the software that I'm using? I'll be back in a sec. But any questions, comments? Is this valuable? I mean, it's good to goodness. This isn't a. Otherwise, I'll just put my camera on and work. So, now, ethics is a critical conversation that we need to be having with our teams and in terms of the companies that we engage with. I'm quickly going to shift a little bit. Give me 2 seconds. I'm just trying to get my screen back on, so just give me a sec. Just going to juggle a couple of things here. Turn my camera back on. Can you see my screen? Again, if you could just put a thumbs up or something on the chat box if you can see my screen. Apologies for that. I obviously had a software failure, one of the things one has to deal with. So, yep, good, frozen, all good. Okay, so you can see my screen looking at the cultivate and construct as well. My screens have switched. So if I'm a little bit disorientated, you know why at the end of the day. So if we're thinking about this, what does it then mean in terms of what I like to think about? Let's get as practical as possible. And I like to think about these two dimensions for leaders to balance. The first dimension is I like to refer to as the strategic dimension. It's the dimension in time. It's exercising foresight. It's in the light of foresight, and in a sense how this works as we work from the future to the present, and we say, well, we make sense of the present in the light of where we want the company to be in the future, and obviously we look back with a view to looking forward, and that's a really important aspect or element of what we're looking for. And so if we again put those three onto a page, the second dimension, which is really important for us to think about, is what I like to think about a dimension in depth. What I mean by that is that as directors, we are accountable for the ongoing assessment of a number of different things that link what is below the surface and above the surface, as I've been saying. So think of this, the horizontal line is the ground. Below the surface is what is, in a sense, invisible. We can't see it. Above the surface is what is seen. And the challenge with our businesses is that they're ultimately tested from what I like to call the inside out. It's what we see on the outside at the end of the day, or what not we see, but our stakeholders, those we impact, see from the outside, that is actually the reality of how we run our businesses. And if we had to put certain words to that, and say, well, what does it then look like in terms of some of those vertical elements? It's essentially saying that if we look at our businesses from the outside in, what do people see in our businesses? They see what I like to call the habits or patterns or systems in the business. They experience how we deal with them based on the behaviors, and habits are the set of collective behaviors that we would have as a business. But ultimately, those collective behaviors on the outside reflect what we value and ultimately what we believe to be valuable from the inside. What is invisible ultimately becomes what is visible. And the challenge is when we think about organizational value statements, we have to somehow find words to formulate what we believe and what we believe to be valuable. And the danger is we try to sound too, in a sense, fancy when we are doing that. Often I look at value statements and you see the same things. Every company out there uses words like customer service, excellence, integrity is almost always on those value statements or value frameworks of businesses. And even the companies that we've seen collapse and crash have got some incredible value statements. If you want some ideas of good values to write down, then Google Enron's values. Because Enron had one of the most well-defined set of values that it's been used as an example for what this often looks like. The problem is, how well is what was beneath the surface linked to what is above the surface? I love this quote by Chesterton, G.K. Chesterton, about words. And it's the danger of words is that we use words beneath the surface to try to describe what we do. He says the word good has many meanings. For example, if a man were to shoot his grandmother at a range of 500 yards, I would call him a good shot, but not necessarily a good man. And so one of the challenges we have is how do we link what is beneath the surface with what is above the surface? And this is where this word ethics is a really important one, because it's the word ethics, in a sense, that is the bridge word. Because the word ethics comes from the word ethos. And one of the most powerful things about that word ethos, so what ethos means essentially is how we are experienced, the disposition, the experience a group of people will have of us as individuals or as groups. If I were to walk into your business, there is an ethos, a way of being that is independent sometimes of your objectives and your intentions. I may see all your value statements on the wall in your reception, but what do I experience when I walk behind the scenes and I meet your people? Or what do I experience when I buy your product, when I need service from your business? That's the reality. And that's one of the key things that ethos does, is it emphasizes that the ethos of a place is more accurately and more credibly identified from the outside looking in than from the inside looking out. And this is one of the challenges that I think we need to be thinking about in our boardrooms and also in our conversations around ethics, is to say, or ask the question, what are we as a business, as a company, from the outside looking in? And is that the same as how we would describe ourselves from the inside looking out? And so this is really important, asking the question, what does what we believe look like on the outside? So if I were to go back a couple of slides to that continuum and say, well, what does it then mean? Is we've got to be asking the question and having the conversations, I would argue, across the business. Do we understand and are we on the same page? Do we define, describe what we believe to be valuable? But also have we asked the question, what does it actually look like on the outside in terms of our behaviors and the habits of the business? Because that's how we get to the question, or to the answer of that question. What does what we believe look like on the outside as well? And so if we go back and ask the question, where then does ethics in a sense fit onto these two dimensions? We've got the dimension in time, foresight, oversight, hindsight. We've got the dimension in depth, where we're thinking about the invisible and the visible. And ethics is that bridge word that sits over, the surface. It's what we see emerging. It's the ethos that emerges from really clarifying what we believe to be valuable and how we deal with that in our businesses. And so if we look last few minutes together and we look at some of the recommendations and what are some of the other conversations we need to be having in our boardroom, is there's also the sense when we think about ethics, it's not just ethics from the company out, but there are actually three spheres in a sense where we have to have the ethical conversation. The first one is, what are we like in the boardroom? Because ultimately the board does set the tone for the ethics of a business. Board members often think we're invisible, but there's this concept of setting the tone at the top, which is really important. And so foundational governance principles use sentences like this, that the governing body should lead ethically and effectively. In other words, there is certainly the performance element, which is critical, but there needs to be ethics as well. What does it mean? They need to lead individually and corporately. So it's not just the group of leaders together, but it's the individuals and the group. And they need to exhibit, which means demonstrate, if they are seen from the outside looking in as individuals, as a team. In terms of ethics and effectiveness, they need to exhibit and cultivate a few key characteristics. And those characteristics that lie beneath the surface are ones we find quite commonly in a lot of the governance recommendations and codes of corporate governance around the world. And they're words like integrity, competence, acting responsibly, acting with accountability, being fair to all stakeholders and transparent. But the critical question we need to ask is, what does that look like in the boardroom and from the boardroom? Because if we are not, as a board, as a team of people, seen even internally to be acting with integrity and competence and responsibility, accountability, fairness and transparency, how can we then expect our businesses to be doing that as well? And so that's a really important part of what governance is all about, is asking the question, what does that look like for us in our businesses? Second key aspect, so that was the first dimension in a sense of governing, is in the boardroom, are we leading effectively, ethically, individually, corporately, exhibiting and cultivating those characteristics of iCraft? But do we then govern the ethics of the organization in a way that supports the establishment of an ethical culture? Which means what we need to be doing is also asking the question, and I would argue getting the rest of the business involved in asking and answering the question, what do those things look like where you are? Because every aspect of the business, in a sense, looks slightly different from the point of view of integrity. That integrity is a foundational governance principle, but the way that it's reflected, the way that it's exhibited. Accountability, everybody's accountable for different things in the business. Responsibility, acting fairly, every part of the business touches on, deals with different sets of stakeholders. And so how do they map out and govern those relationships and manage those relationships ethically and effectively as well? And so that's where we need to think as governors about some of those core things that are both in ISO 37000 as well as things on the governance compass, SADAR governance compass. How do we create from our purpose the right strategy and model for value generation? How do we think about our business model with a values hat on, a belief and purpose hat on, and not just a financial hat on? Really important. And then how do we give away accountability through our delegation of authority so that we can retain oversight, hold people accountable, ultimately in the best interests of the company itself? And then the third sphere, in a sense, or circle, so there's in the boardroom, there's in the company, and the tools in the company are things like our codes of conduct, whistleblowing internally, our structures and systems we can put in place and design well to govern the ethics of the organization. But the third perspective, which needs to be aligned, is ensuring that the organization is and is seen to be, and that's an important phrase. We can say that we are something, but we also need to be seen to be it from the outside looking in, a responsible corporate citizen. And the definition of that has become quite broad, because it's how do we deal with some of the broader aspects, economically, social, ecologically, different conversations and challenges that we have in terms of what do we take a position on, what not. Those kind of things are really, really important from an ethical point of view, so that those people looking from the outside in, and that's essentially how we would define our stakeholders, they would also say, this company is a responsible corporate citizen, and that should then be a reflection of how the business works as a whole, and that should also be a reflection of how the boardroom works as well. And that ultimately, if we look at something like ISO 37000, if I jump back to that graphic that I referred to earlier, the ISO 37000 is quite powerful because it's a model of from the core outward. We touched on the core being the purpose, but the outside circle is essentially what are called the outcomes of good governance. Because ultimately, whether our businesses are well governed or not is an issue not of what we say it is, but what other people view it from the outside looking in. And that's where the three key outcomes of good governance, the foundational one, I would argue, ethical behavior. Are we seen to be ethical, to have an ethical culture which is reflected in ethical behavior through the business? On the right-hand side, effective performance, absolutely essential that our businesses perform. And right now, that's a massive challenge because of the issues and the challenges and the complexity we are navigating through. We understand that. Thirdly, responsible stewardship, really thinking about how are we seen, as we said, to be a good corporate citizenship in terms of being a responsible steward of the things that we use in the business, we utilize in the business, giving it a good account for that. And so that's why I talk about it, and I put it on this slide as not just the circles, but the roots and the fruits. Ultimately, the roots are our purpose embedded in good values. The responsibilities are the structures and systems we put in place. The measurements or the outcomes, so the things we need to be aware of, are the ethical behavior, effective performance, and responsible stewardship. And so lastly, and as I just wrap up, it would be great to get any questions or comments. Thanks, Frank. Saw your comment there about the insights, but let's see in terms of what then needs to be aligned. What do we need to be aligned if we think about, and what are some of the critical things in our businesses? Firstly, we need to be aligned in terms of the words we use and their meanings. One of the biggest challenges when we have something like values, as I mentioned earlier, is it's beneath the surface. So we need to define our terms, and we need to, from the boardroom, from the senior management teams throughout the business, make sure that everybody has a common understanding, a shared understanding of the words we use to capture the meaning of our values. Because the reality is we use words to describe things, and everybody brings their own definition to that. So really important that we have good conversations in our businesses around values. And if I pick up that someone is using a word in a way that is different from the way that I'm using it, we need to find a shared space where we can actually, understand that thing together, which means I may need to move in terms of my understanding, someone else may need to move in terms of their understanding, but we need to be on the same page in terms of the words we use, the meanings they have, because then and only then can we start asking questions. What structures or systems do we need to put in place? Because remember, this is the construction element of good governance. This is the policies we would use, our board charter, our code of conduct, our whistleblowing structures. Ashraf, your comment a little bit earlier, absolutely essential to think about in terms of, are we putting in place structures that are usable, that do the right thing in terms of protecting the right people in the right way, create independence of those structures, because ultimately the structures result in the actions of the business. And it's ultimately on the actions as experienced by stakeholders, internal and external, that we are ultimately, in inverted commas, judged on the effectiveness of our value system and beliefs. And a critical part is also incentives. The reality is, famous quote, I think by a gentleman who wrote the book about the theory of constraints. He said, you tell me what and how you will measure me, and I'll tell you how I behave. We've got to make sure that our incentive systems and what they motivate and lead to in terms of behavior are aligned. And so if nothing else, these are some key conversations to think about in your businesses in asking the question, how do we unpack the foundations or the minefield? So we build appropriately businesses that within which we cultivate the right culture of ethics, and we avoid the landmines, because landmines are dangerous and can destroy our businesses. So with that in mind, I'm going to pick up on a couple of the questions and the comments going back a little bit. But as we go, please drop any others and put it onto either the chat box or the Q&A box. So yeah, one of the key things, going back, Ashraf, to your comments on whistleblowers, I think that the danger with whistleblowing is it's become a tick the box exercise where we have structures in place for whistleblowing, but we don't design them to protect the right people. And I think it's a challenge. I know it's a challenge, because it's one of those things that is really, really difficult. I read an article recently about the fact that there are some construction projects done in the KZN in KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, which are the developers are moving out of them because of the prevalence of corruption in that area. And so really, really important. And unfortunately, we've seen how whistleblowers have been treated. Possibly a thing to do is to design something that is and then test it, and make sure that the accountability for the testing and the running of that protects the right people in the right way. It's possibly a conversation we can pick up on outside of this, which we'd be happy to do. Thanks, Frank, in terms of your foundation on shaping the future well-being. I think right now the world has faced the biggest crisis it's been through for a long time, and we're not over. My anticipation, again, I'm not trying to predict the worst, but we've got to accept that we've probably got another 2 or 3 or 4 years. I would argue that the 2020s are going to be a decade we all want to forget when we're older and wiser. But let's learn from what we're going through and have the right conversations. This is the right time to raise these issues if they've never been raised, and in our relationships. So, Frank, what I like about your comment and question is it's linking what we've said to different relationships, because there are employee relationships, supplier relationships, financial relationships. Really important that values and beliefs are expressed in those relationships. And so having conversations around that would be really important as well. Back to your comment, absolutely. When we think about ultimately values, they are an intricate, the organizational culture conversation is very much part of the purpose, strategy, and direction, which is the vision conversation. And so really, really important for boards to be on the same page as to what direction they are heading in, because otherwise, when you ask a board, where are we going, you don't get a single direction, you get a whole lot of different directions. And that's a challenge. So having those conversations is absolutely critical as well. Right now, what an opportunity, and I'm putting that in inverted commas because I recognize that some of you are going through really tough things in business, but we need to learn how to navigate in new ways. And a big part of that is making sure we're aligned in terms of our values and not just what we want to achieve, but what we want to be known for as well. Ashraf, your question, and if there are any others, please drop them onto the chat box. Thanks for asking the question about the Applied Directorship program, how it works, and this is on one slide. And what we will be doing after this webinar is we'll be sending a pack of information to you about the Applied Directorship program. The Applied Directorship program is something we designed 6 or 7 or 8 years ago. We launched almost 6 years ago in 2017. And back to you, a couple of people from on now who have been through it. But what we do is we take you on a journey of 11 modules, most of it around the governance compass, which you can see there on the right-hand side. Those are the key themes of governance, and the aim is to build a working knowledge of all of those things through some lecture-based, some videos, as well as a board simulation process that we run as part of that. It is an 11-month journey, because what we were finding is that this governance space is a lot of information, and we also want to ensure that it is applied. That's why we call it the Applied Directorship Program, so that people have a chance over effectively a year to learn things and apply them, learn them and apply them, learn them and apply them. We also made a decision early on, to your question, Ashraf, that every person who's been through the ADP retains access to all the information that they go through, all the videos, all of the content. We occasionally update the platform, and so what we normally do is if one of the alumni contacts us and says they can't get access, we will make sure they get that. But that was part of the process, was to say, how do we provide someone not just with a learning journey, but also with a library of information to use into the future. So thanks for asking that question. As I said, we'll be getting hold of you in the next couple of days with a mail, just to provide you information about the Applied Directorship Program, and please get hold of us if you would be interested in launching. And there's an opportunity right now, just while it's on my mind, that we're actually offering access to Module 1 at the moment for free, just to look and see. So that's something we'll also be sending you information about, and we'll be running a couple of Module 1s in the next couple of months for those people interested. That looks like the last of the questions. I trust this has been valuable in terms of just thinking through some of the opportunities and challenges in thinking about unpacking ethics, unpacking values and beliefs in your business. I do encourage you, as mentioned right in the beginning, my view was not to say these are all the answers, because actually you need to think about what are the answers in your business, in your context, that align what you're saying and what they mean, what you mean by that. Aligning the structures and the systems and the policies and the processes, all of those things are the trellis upon which the plant, the tree, the vine of your business actually grows. And ultimately, we want to grow healthy vines so that we can yield the fruit of that, and that we can have productive, healthy businesses that also help the economy and society to blossom and flourish. And really, that's what we need to think about in terms of our incentives in our businesses. Are we thinking about things and putting things in place that incentivize the right thing, incentivize healthy growth, incentivize sustainable activity and sustainable long-term visions for our business, so that we can achieve our purpose and accomplish what we set out to. So thank you for taking the time. As mentioned, we'll be in touch with you soon. All the very best. Enjoy.